My name is Claire Ashford, and 6 months ago, I watched my husband call another woman his fiancé in front of 400 people. When I stood up to confront him, he looked directly at me and said, "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." Security dragged me out while the room applauded. But here's what no one in that ballroom knew. I had something that would destroy everything he'd built. And in 3 weeks, I would use it. Before I tell you what happened, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if stories about quiet justice matter to you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is, because what I'm about to share changed how I understand power, betrayal, and what it really means to disappear. To understand why that night broke me and what came after, I need to take you back to when I first realized I was being erased. I grew up in a small house in Connecticut with parents who loved each other fiercely and loved me even more. My father was an engineer. My mother was an artist. Watercolors mostly. Soft landscapes that hung in every room of our home. We weren't wealthy, but we were warm. When I was 16, they went to a gallery opening in the city. A drunk driver ran a red light on the way home. I got the call at 11:47 p.m. from a police officer whose voice I still hear in my dreams. After that, I went to live with my grandmother, my mother's mother, a quiet woman who taught me to cook, to sew, and to keep going when the world felt too heavy to carry. She passed my senior year of college, heart failure in her sleep. I found her in the morning, still holding the book she'd been reading. I had no siblings, no aunts or uncles I knew well. My mother had mentioned a brother once, Elias. She'd called him, but they'd been estranged since before I was born. Something about family money and a disagreement about how it should be used. I never looked for him. I assumed he didn't want to be found, so I built my life alone. I worked my way through college. I landed a job at a tech startup in San Francisco. By 24, I'd helped grow that company from 12 employees to 300. That's where I met Daniel Mercer. He was 31 when we met, already climbing the ladder with the kind of confidence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He had sharp features, expensive suits, and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person he'd ever really seen. "You're not like the other women here," he said the first night we talked, leaning close enough that I could smell his cologne. "You actually have ideas." I should have heard the red flag in that sentence, the casual dismissal of every other woman in the room, the implication that thinking was unusual for someone like me. But I was 24 and lonely, and still carrying the weight of everyone I'd lost. I heard a compliment. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive, charming, interested in my work, my opinions, my future. He took me to restaurants I couldn't pronounce, introduced me to people whose names appeared in magazines, made me feel like I was finally part of something larger than myself. When he proposed, I said yes before he finished the question. We married in a small ceremony. His family, a cold mother, an absent father, a few cousins who looked through me rather than at me, and a handful of my friends, people I'd meet less and less as the years went on. I didn't notice it at first. The way he'd correct my opinions in front of others, then laugh it off as a joke. The way he'd sigh when I mentioned my work, as if my career was an inconvenience rather than an accomplishment. The way he'd remind me, gently, that I didn't have anyone else. "I'm all you have," he'd say when I questioned his late nights, his vague explanations, his phone always face down on the table. Why would you risk that? And because I believed him, because I was terrified that he was right, I stopped questioning. I stopped noticing. I made myself smaller, inch by inch, until I fit perfectly into the space he'd designed for me. What I didn't know was that across the country, my uncle, my mother's brother, the man I'd never met, had been watching from a distance, tracking my life through public records and quiet inquiries, waiting for the moment I would need him. His name was Elias Ashford, and he was worth more than Daniel's entire industry combined. The gala was supposed to be Daniel's coronation. He'd been climbing for years, strategic partnerships, calculated friendships, a reputation polished to a mirror shine. Every handshake was an investment, every conversation was an audition. He collected people like currency, and he spent them just as easily. That night, the National Business Alliance was honoring him with their Rising Visionary Award. 400 guests, black tie, live streamed to thousands. I found out about it from a stranger. That morning, I stopped at a cafe near the venue to grab coffee before running errands. I was wearing jeans and a sweater, hair still damp from the shower. I hadn't planned to stay long. I certainly hadn't planned to talk to anyone. Then I heard my husband's name. "You must be excited for tonight," a voice said behind me. I turned, smiling politely, recognizing one of his golf friends. We'd met a handful of times over the years. Not close, friendly enough. "Tonight?" I asked. He laughed. "Yeah, the Gala. Huge deal for him. Award, big crowd. Sponsors everywhere." My smile froze. "The Gala?" I repeated. He frowned slightly. "Yeah. He said you couldn't make it. Some family thing?" The words landed wrong. Not painful yet, just off. I nodded slowly, murmured something about scheduling conflicts, and took my coffee to go. In my car, I sat for a long moment, staring at nothing. Then I checked my phone. No invitation, no reminder, no casual mention, nothing. I almost convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd sent the details to my old email. Maybe I'd overlooked a calendar notification. Maybe this was just Daniel being Daniel, forgetful about anything that didn't directly serve his ascent. Then I saw the live stream link trending on social media an hour later. His face, his name. A countdown to the biggest night of his career. And not a single word to his wife. I didn't go to make a scene. I didn't go for revenge. I didn't even go for answers. I went because something inside me knew that if I didn't show up, I would disappear completely. I would become a footnote in his story, a character he'd edited out without telling me. I needed to see it with my own eyes. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the ceiling like captured stars. An orchestra played softly near the entrance. Champagne towers caught the glow from every angle, and the room hummed with the particular energy of people who knew they were being watched. I'd borrowed a dress from the back of my closet, something I'd worn to a charity event years ago, and stood near the back of the room, heart pounding, scanning the crowd for my husband. I found him on stage. The spotlight caught his profile as he smiled at the audience, confident and comfortable, accepting applause like it was oxygen. He looked exactly like the man I'd married. Handsome, magnetic, certain, and standing beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, was a woman I recognized. His cousin, that's what he'd told me. For 8 months, he'd introduced her at dinners, at parties, at family gatherings. "This is Vanessa, my cousin from Chicago." She was 30, beautiful in a sculpted way that suggested careful maintenance. She laughed at his jokes with her whole body. She touched his shoulder when she spoke to him. She texted him late at night, and when I questioned it, he'd look at me like I was being ridiculous. "She's family," he'd said once, exasperation creeping into his voice. "Relax. You're being paranoid. You always overthink things. This is why we can't have nice conversations." I'd believed him because believing him was easier than imagining this. Now she stood under the spotlight in a gown that cost more than my car, her smile radiant and rehearsed, as if she had practiced this exact moment in the mirror. Daniel leaned toward the microphone. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced ease. "This award means everything to me, but I couldn't have done any of it without the love and support of my fiancée, Vanessa, who's always believed in me." The word echoed in my head like a gunshot. Fiancé. I was his wife. I had been his wife for 5 years. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around me, hundreds of people clapped and smiled, rising to their feet. The room roared with approval. I didn't move. I couldn't. The applause swelled again when he leaned down and kissed her. Not a polite kiss, not a congratulatory peck. A real kiss. The kind that announces ownership. The kind he hadn't given me in years. The room erupted. Something inside me cracked so violently it felt physical, like bones splintering under pressure. My vision blurred. The air vanished from my lungs. That was the moment the lie finally died. I stood up so fast, my chair scraped against the floor. "Wait," I whispered. No one heard me. My legs felt unsteady as memories rushed in all at once. The dinner where he'd introduced her as family. The way she'd laughed too loudly at his jokes. The way he'd brushed off every question with a smirk and a sigh. "You're being paranoid. You're imagining things. You always overthink." I had believed him, because believing him was easier than imagining this. I tried again, louder this time. Daniel. A few heads turned. He stiffened on stage. Slowly, reluctantly, he looked out into the crowd. Our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Not shock, not guilt, annoyance. Confusion rippled through the audience as he leaned toward the microphone again. "I'm sorry," he said calmly, his voice steady, controlled. "I don't know who you are. Please sit down." The words hit harder than the kiss. Laughter bubbled nervously in the crowd. A few people exchanged glances. Someone whispered. Someone raised a phone. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. "No," I said, my voice breaking now. "Daniel, it's me." I took a step toward the stage, tears streaming freely. My hands reached out, shaking. Vanessa, his fiancée, tightened her grip on his arm. Her face was composed, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. He didn't look at me again. Instead, he turned slightly and lifted his hand. Security moved immediately. 2 men in dark suits appeared at my sides, gripping my arms firmly. I gasped as they pulled me back. "Please," I cried. "Please, just listen to me." Daniel sighed into the microphone. "Remove her," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned room. "She's disturbing the event." Someone in the crowd laughed nervously. Then another. Then the laughter spread like a disease, mixing with whispers and the click of camera phones. My heels scraped against the floor as I struggled. Sobbing now, panic consuming me, I screamed his name as they dragged me toward the exit. "Daniel! Daniel! Please!" He turned back to the audience and smiled. "My apologies for the interruption," he said smoothly. "Some people just can't handle being outside the spotlight." The room laughed again, louder this time, more confident, and I was dragged out like an animal, my cries swallowed by the closing doors. I don't remember how I got outside. One moment I was fighting the hands on my arms, my throat raw from screaming his name, and the next I was on the steps of the hotel, bent forward, retching, my clutch spilled across the stone. The night air hit my face, cold and sharp. Inside, I could still hear the music resuming, the applause returning, life going on without me. My phone buzzed, a message from him. "You humiliated me. Don't ever do that again." I stared at the screen, my vision swimming. A laugh escaped me, thin, broken, the kind of sound that didn't belong to a person who was still whole. Humiliated him. I pressed my back against the wall and slid down until I was sitting on the ground, knees pulled to my chest. My mind replayed the word over and over. Fiancé. I whispered it aloud, as if saying it might make it make sense. It didn't. Then, another message appeared, a number I didn't recognize. "I'm downstairs." My breath caught. I pushed myself up, my legs weak, and wiped my face with shaking hands. When I rounded the corner toward the hotel lobby, I saw him immediately. He stood near the entrance, tall, still, wearing a simple dark coat. No entourage, no security, just him, waiting. His face was weathered but kind, and his eyes held something I couldn't name. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask why I was crying. He opened his arms, and I fell into them like I was 16 again, like I was burying my parents, like I was finding my grandmother in her bed, like every loss I'd ever suffered had been waiting for this moment to finally be held. "It's okay," he murmured, one hand steady on my back. "I've got you." We didn't move for a long time. People passed by. Cars pulled up and left. The world kept spinning. Finally, when my breathing slowed, he guided me toward a quiet sitting area off the lobby. He sat beside me, close but not crowding, his presence calm and solid. "Tell me," he said softly. I stared at the floor for several seconds, trying to gather the pieces of myself. "He said she was his cousin," I whispered. "For months, he told me I was imagining things, and tonight," my voice cracked. "Tonight he called her his fiancée, in front of everyone." The man's jaw tightened. He didn't interrupt. "He kissed her," I continued, tears spilling again. "On stage. And when I tried to talk to him, he said he didn't know me. He had me dragged out like I was some criminal." Silence stretched between us, heavy and dangerous. "Who are you?" I finally asked. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. Faded, worn at the edges, Two young people standing in a garden, a man and a woman, maybe 20 years old. "That's your mother," he said, pointing to the woman. "And that's me." I stared at the photo, my breath catching. "My name is Elias Ashford," he said. "I'm your uncle, and I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." He didn't take me back to the hotel room I'd booked for the night. Instead, he brought me to a private residence overlooking the water, a place he rarely used, he said. Understated, elegant. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. He made tea. He sat across from me at a small table while I wrapped my hands around the mug, the warmth grounding me just enough to breathe. "I don't understand," I said finally. "My mother never talked about you. She had her reasons." Elias folded his hands on the table. "When your mother married your father, our family disapproved. Your grandfather, in particular. He was a proud man, rigid. He believed love was a luxury that should come after security, not before." "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything." Elias paused. "Your mother was supposed to inherit the family estate. When she chose your father, your grandfather cut her out. She never forgave him for it, and she never forgave me for not fighting harder on her behalf." I set down the mug. "You let that happen?" "I was young, weak. I told myself I'd fix it later." He looked at me steadily. By the time I found the courage to reach out, she was gone. The silence stretched between us. "After she died," he continued, "I tried to find you, but you were already in your grandmother's care. The lawyers said it would only complicate things. They said you needed stability, not a stranger showing up claiming to be family. So you just watched? I protected you, from a distance." He leaned forward. "I've known about Daniel for 3 years. I've watched him diminish you, isolate you, rewrite your reality. I've been waiting for the moment you would finally see what he was." "Why didn't you warn me?" "Because you loved him, and love isn't something you can argue with. You had to see it for yourself." I felt tears welling again. "So, what now?" Elias reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Now," he said, sliding it across the table, "you decide what to do with this." Inside were financial records, corporate filings, loan agreements, a detailed analysis of Daniel's company, its holdings, its investors, its vulnerabilities. "He's leveraged," Elias explained. "Loans against projected growth, promises to investors based on contracts that haven't closed. One major pullout, and the whole thing collapses." I looked up at him. "You want me to destroy him?" "I want you to have options." He met my gaze evenly. "What you do with them is your choice." For 3 days, I read everything. I learned how acquisitions worked, how boards could be influenced, how a single majority stakeholder could reshape an entire company without raising their voice. And I learned something else, something that made my hands shake when I finally understood it. My mother's inheritance, the one my grandfather had tried to take from her, had been held in trust, not eliminated, just waiting. For 20 years, it had grown quietly, managed by lawyers instructed to release it when I was stable. "Stable?" I'd asked. "Away from anyone who would use it against you," Elias had replied. The trust was worth more than Daniel's company, more than his investors, more than everything he'd built, and it was mine. "This isn't about revenge," Elias said on the 3rd night, as I stared at the numbers in disbelief. "It's about clarity. You spent 5 years being told you were invisible. Now you can prove you were always the one they should have seen." I looked at him. "What if I don't want to be seen?" "Then we walk away. You never have to touch any of this." He paused. "But I think you do want it. I think you've wanted it for a long time." He was right. Elias's team moved quietly at first. They approached Daniel's investors one by one, not with threats, with better offers, better terms, better protection. Within 10 days, 3 of his 6 major backers had shifted their positions. Daniel didn't notice immediately. He was too busy managing the Gala fallout, the viral video, the questions about his mystery wife, the whispers that followed him into every meeting. Someone had uploaded the moment security dragged me out. Then someone else had slowed it down, captioned it, turned it into content. Comments exploded. He said he didn't know her. That's his wife. Watch her face when she realizes. That's not embarrassment. That's complete erasure. Daniel's PR team worked overtime to control the narrative. an ex with mental health issues, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Regrettable, but not his fault. The internet didn't buy it. By the time he realized what was happening to his company, it was too late. The emergency board meeting was called on a Tuesday morning. Daniel arrived confident, expecting damage control. He wore his best suit. He carried his laptop like armor. He smiled at the receptionist, winked at his assistant, and strode into the conference room like nothing in the world could touch him. The CEO was already there, flanked by lawyers Daniel didn't recognize. "Good morning," Daniel said, taking his seat. "Let's get this sorted out." The CEO didn't smile. "There's been an acquisition," he said, his voice strained. Daniel laughed. "What are you talking about? We're not for sale." "We weren't." The CEO slid a document across the table. "But we are now." Daniel scanned the page. His smile faded. "This can't be right," he muttered. "These numbers don't match our cap table." "They do now." The screen behind them flickered to life. A single name appeared, Claire Ashford. Daniel stared at it without comprehension. The door opened, and I walked in. I wore a simple charcoal suit, no jewelry, no drama, nothing that asked for attention. I met every eye in the room before settling on his. For a moment, no one spoke. Daniel stood abruptly. "This is a joke." "It isn't. You can't. You don't have..." He looked around wildly. "Someone explain what's happening." The CEO cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ashford is the majority shareholder, effective this morning." Daniel's face went white. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "She doesn't have that kind of money. She couldn't. You never asked," I said calmly. His head snapped toward me. "What?" I stepped closer, my voice steady. "You never asked about my family. You never asked about my history. You never asked about anything that didn't reflect well on you." I tilted my head slightly. "You were so busy making me small that you never considered I might be larger than you imagined." Security stepped closer to Daniel. He pulled back, panic rising. "You planned this. From the beginning. This is revenge." "No," I replied evenly. "The gala was when I stopped protecting you. Everything after that was just math." He stared at me, mouth working silently. "You can't do this to me," he finally managed. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. "I didn't," I said. "You did it to yourself." They didn't drag him out the way they dragged me. They didn't have to. He left on his own, shoulders hunched, face ashen, flanked by security guards who watched him like he might break something on the way out. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. When the room cleared, Elias appeared at my side. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "I think so. It'll be loud for a while," he warned. "The press, the speculation. People will want you to be a villain or a hero." "I know. And you're still okay?" I looked out the window at the city stretching below us, the same city where I'd been dragged out of a ballroom 3 weeks earlier. "I'm not okay," I admitted. "But I'm not invisible anymore. That's enough for now." Daniel didn't go home immediately. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 2 hours, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. His phone lit up every few seconds with new notifications. Missed calls from Vanessa, messages from colleagues, alerts from industry blogs already speculating about the acquisition. He didn't open any of them. His mind kept dragging him back to the boardroom, to my face, calm, composed. Nothing like the woman he'd dismissed as emotional, impractical, invisible. "You never asked about my family." The words echoed like an accusation. He had never asked because he'd never cared to. He'd liked believing I was small. It made him feel larger. When he finally drove home, the lights were on. Vanessa sat on the couch, scrolling furiously through her phone. Her eyes snapped up the second he walked in. "What did you do?" she demanded. He dropped his keys on the counter. "I didn't do anything." She stood abruptly, shoving her phone in his face. "Then explain this. My name is everywhere. People are calling me a homewrecker. My father's been getting calls all morning." "It's just noise," he said weakly. "It'll blow over." "Blow over?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your wife, your actual wife, just took over your company, in front of everyone. And you told me she was nobody." He turned away. "You said she was unstable," Vanessa continued, her voice rising. You said she couldn't even hold a job. You said she had no family, no connections, nothing. I believed that. You believed what was convenient. She grabbed her purse from the counter. Do you have any idea what this does to me? To my reputation? My father's partners are already distancing themselves. Vanessa, please? No. She held up a hand. I'm not going down with you. I have a future to protect. She walked to the bedroom. He followed, watching helplessly as she pulled a suitcase from the closet and began throwing clothes into it. Where are you going? Away from here. She didn't look at him. Away from you. We were supposed to get married, he said, his voice cracking. We had plans. She paused then, finally meeting his eyes. We had an arrangement, she corrected coldly. You were supposed to be worth something. Now you're just a liability. The suitcase zipped closed with brutal finality. Vanessa, I love you. She walked past him without stopping. You love yourself, she said at the door. I was just the mirror you liked looking into. The door slammed behind her. Daniel stood in the empty apartment, the silence pressing in from every direction. His phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa's father. Don't contact my daughter again, and don't expect any favors from my network. You're finished. He sank onto the couch, staring at the wall. For the first time in his adult life, he had no idea what to do next. His phone buzzed again. A text from me. We need to talk. But I wasn't the only one watching Daniel's world collapse. 3 days after the acquisition, Vanessa's Instagram went private. Her LinkedIn profile was quietly updated. The engagement mentioned in her bio disappeared overnight. Her father released a statement, distancing his firm from personal matters involving former associates. Industry gossip moved fast. Did you hear about the Thornton girl? The one who was engaged to Mercer? Engaged to a married man, apparently. Her father is furious. Within a week, Vanessa had been uninvited from 2 charity boards. Her application to join an exclusive women's networking group was mysteriously delayed. The boutique PR firm she'd been consulting for stopped returning her calls. I heard about it through Elias's network. She's trying to rebrand, one of his assistants reported, calling herself a victim of Daniel's manipulation. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not pity. Just the recognition that consequences don't discriminate. A month later, I saw her name in a small trade publication. She'd taken a junior position at a startup in another state, a far cry from the executive role she'd been positioning herself for. The article didn't mention Daniel at all. She was rebuilding. Just like everyone else who'd ever bet on the wrong person. Daniel's unraveling happened in stages. First, the board froze his assets pending investigation. His company credit cards stopped working. His expense account was suspended. Then came the interviews. HR brought in outside counsel lawyers who didn't owe Daniel any favors. They asked about undisclosed relationships, about conflicts of interest, about the exact nature of his arrangement with Vanessa and whether company resources had been used to facilitate it. Daniel hired his own lawyer. The legal fees started eating through his savings. Meanwhile, his reputation eroded publicly. The Gala video kept resurfacing. Every few days, someone would find a new angle, add new commentary, turn it into fresh content. Watch his face when she calls his name. He doesn't even flinch. That's not panic, that's calculation. The way he says, I don't know her, he'd practiced that. Comment sections exploded with analysis. People paused the video at the moment. I was dragged out, zooming in on expressions, interpreting body language, constructing narratives. Some called me a hero. Some called me a scorned woman with too much money and too little sense. I didn't engage with any of it, but Daniel did. He couldn't help himself. He created anonymous accounts to defend himself in comment sections. He sent angry emails to journalists who covered the story. He called in favors from old contacts, trying to plant counter-narratives. None of it worked. The more he fought, the more attention the story received. The more attention it received, the more thoroughly his reputation was dissected. 3 months after the gala, Daniel's access badge stopped working. He arrived at the office on a Thursday morning, swiped his card, and watched the light flash red. He tried again. Red. There must be a mistake, he told the security guard. The guard checked his list and shook his head. I'm sorry, sir. You'll need to check in with HR. I'm a senior executive, Daniel snapped. I don't check in with anyone. Not anymore, the guard said quietly. Daniel was escorted to a small conference room where 2 HR representatives waited with a folder. Your position has been terminated, one of them said, sliding the documents across the table. Effective immediately. Daniel stared at the papers without comprehension. Terminated? On what grounds? Multiple ethics violations. Conflict of interest. Conduct unbecoming of an executive. The HR representative paused. Would you like me to read the complete list? This is retaliation, Daniel said, his voice rising. She's doing this because of what happened at the gala. The investigation was conducted by an independent firm, the representative replied calmly. Mrs. Ashford was not involved in the proceedings. That was true. I hadn't needed to be. Daniel's own choices had provided all the ammunition anyone needed. You can't do this, he said weakly. I built this company. You helped build a company that now belongs to someone else. The representative stood. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You have 30 minutes. Daniel packed his desk in silence while 2 guards watched. He took the photos, the awards, the business cards from a career that no longer existed. When he reached the lobby, a small crowd had gathered. Former colleagues who'd once laughed at his jokes, sought his approval, competed for his attention. Now they just watched. One of them, a junior analyst who'd always been eager to please, caught his eye. Daniel expected sympathy, maybe solidarity. Instead, the analyst looked away. Daniel walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box, his entire professional identity reduced to what fit inside it. I watched from a window 3 floors up. Elias appeared beside me. Do you feel anything? He asked. I considered the question. I feel like I'm watching a house that was always on fire finally collapse, I said. There's no satisfaction in it, but there's no guilt either. He nodded slowly. That's as healthy as it gets, he said. Some people spend years trying to feel something that isn't there. Below, Daniel reached his car. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the building, perhaps waiting for someone to come running out with an apology or an explanation. No one did. Eventually, he got in and drove away. I turned from the window. Now what? I asked. Now, Elias said, you build something that matters. A text from me. We need to talk. He came to the meeting desperate, but trying not to show it. He wore a different suit, less expensive, less confident. His hands trembled slightly when he sat down across from me. Elias stood near the window, watching but not interfering. I didn't mean for it to go that far, Daniel said quickly. At the gala, I panicked. There were cameras everywhere. My investors were watching. I couldn't stop, I said quietly. He stopped. You didn't panic, I continued. You chose. The same way you chose every day for 5 years. You chose to lie, to diminish, to erase. The gala wasn't a mistake. It was the truth finally becoming public. His face crumpled. I loved you. You have to believe that. I believe you loved how I made you look, I replied. Small, manageable, grateful. Someone who would never outshine you. Someone who would disappear when convenient. That's not. It is. I leaned forward. You told me I was paranoid when I questioned your cousin. You told me I was imagining things when I noticed the late-night texts. You told me I was the problem every single time I got close to the truth. He said nothing. Do you know what that's called? I asked. He didn't answer. It's called gaslighting. And you were very, very good at it. Silence filled the room. I don't hate you, I added finally. That would require me to still care about your opinion. I don't. Then why are we here? He asked weakly. Because I want you to understand something. I stood, looking down at him. You didn't lose your company because I took revenge. You lost it because you spent 5 years building a life on lies. And lies eventually collapse. I walked to the door, then paused. This is the last conversation we'll have. Consider it a gift. He was still sitting there when I left, staring at the table, shoulders slumped. I didn't look back. The weeks that followed weren't triumphant. They were exhausting. I met with lawyers, board members, employees who didn't know whether to respect me or resent me. I learned that power doesn't silence criticism, it sharpens it. Headlines appeared. Revenge wife takes over husband's company. The gala that cost him everything. Claire Ashford, victim or villain. I read them once, then stopped. Elias found me one evening, staring out the window of the office he'd arranged for me. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You can step back anytime." I shook my head. "No, I need to understand this. I need to know I can do it." He nodded. "Then understand this first. Power doesn't mean cruelty. It means choice." I swallowed. "I don't want to become like him." "You won't." He came to stand beside me. "You know the difference between you and Daniel? He needed to diminish others to feel large. You don't." I thought about that for a long time. He was right. Daniel's investigation dragged on for months. Conflict of interest, ethics violations, undisclosed relationships, public conduct unbecoming of an executive. The HR department didn't fire him outright that would have made him a martyr. Instead, they stripped him of authority inch by inch, assignment by assignment, until there was nothing left to take. His access badge stopped working on a Thursday. His office was reassigned on a Friday. By Monday, his name had been removed from the company directory. He tried to call me twice during that period. I didn't answer. He sent emails, first angry, then pleading, then pathetically reflective. I know I made mistakes. I didn't realize what I had. Please let me explain. I deleted them without reading past the first line. One evening, he showed up at the office building. Security stopped him at the entrance. "I just want to talk to her," he said loudly. "She owes me that much." I watched from the window above, arms crossed. Elias appeared beside me. "Do you want to go down there?" I shook my head. "No, I don't owe him anything." Security escorted him out. He looked up at the building once before getting in his car. I stepped back from the window. "That felt different than I expected," I admitted. "How so?" "I thought I'd feel satisfied. Or vindicated." I paused. "I just feel empty." Elias nodded. "That's clarity. It doesn't celebrate. It settles. The company Daniel built didn't survive. Not because I destroyed it. I didn't need to. The foundation was too weak to support the weight of his lies. Investors pulled out. Contracts dissolved. Key employees left for competitors who didn't have PR nightmares attached to their names. Within 6 months, the company was sold for parts to a conglomerate that wanted the technology but not the baggage. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. Instead, I built something new. A platform focused on exactly what I'd lacked: protection, content ownership, reputation management, crisis systems designed to prevent the kind of public erasure I'd experienced. I called it clarity. Clients came slowly, at first people who'd heard the story, and wanted to know if the woman in the video was as competent as she was compelling. I didn't trade on the drama. I didn't do interviews about betrayal. I just built something that worked. And something that worked turned out to be exactly what people needed. 6 months have passed since the gala. The viral video eventually faded, as these things do. My name stopped trending. The reporters moved on to newer scandals with fresher villains. But some things are different now. I run a company. Not Daniel's, I let that die the death it deserved, but my own. Clarity employs 43 people. We've secured contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies. Last quarter, we turned our first significant profit. More importantly, I understand what I'm doing. Not because Elias handed me a manual because I earned it. My uncle calls once a week. We're still learning each other, still filling in the gaps left by decades of distance. Some days it's awkward. Some days it's easy. Most days it's somewhere in between. He told me recently that my mother would be proud. I cried for an hour after that call. Not from sadness, from something that felt like coming home. I haven't spoken to Daniel in 4 months. The last time we saw each other was at a coffee shop near my office. He'd requested the meeting just to talk, he'd said. I almost didn't go. He looked older when he arrived. Thinner. His suit didn't fit the way it used to. His eyes had lost that confident gleam I'd once found so attractive. "You look different," he said when I sat down. I didn't respond. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he continued. "About us. About what happened. About what I did wrong." I waited. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I just didn't think—" "That's where you should stop," I interrupted calmly. "You didn't think. That's exactly the point." He ran a hand through his hair. "You could have warned me. About your uncle. About the money. About everything. I looked at him steadily. You never asked, and even if you had, I wouldn't have told you. Why? Because you treated love like leverage, I replied. And you would have used it against me. Silence stretched between us. Is there any chance? He started. No, I said gently. And this is the last conversation we'll have. He nodded slowly, something finally settling in his face that looked like acceptance. I stood to leave, but he caught my arm one last time. Do you ever think about us? He asked. About how it used to be. I considered the question. No, I said honestly. I think about who I was, and I'm glad she's gone. I walked out without looking back. Here's what I've learned. When someone calls you a stranger, believe them. Not because they're right about who you are, but because they're telling you exactly who they are. The betrayal didn't begin with the kiss. It didn't begin with the affair. It began the first time he rewrote reality and expected me to accept it. The first time he said, "You're imagining things," and I believed him. The first time he said, "You're being paranoid," and I apologized. The first time he made me feel small, and I thanked him for it. The gala didn't create the truth. It exposed it. And exposure, I've discovered, is its own kind of freedom. I used to think closure would feel loud. A confrontation, a dramatic apology, a moment where everything that was taken from me would be acknowledged and returned with interest. It didn't. Closure arrived on an ordinary morning, when I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about Daniel at all. No tightness in my chest, no replaying conversations, no imaginary arguments where I finally said the perfect thing. Just quiet. I noticed it while brushing my teeth. The mirror caught my reflection, and for once, my mind didn't drift back to the gala, the chandeliers, the word fiancé, the sound of my heels scraping against the floor. That chapter had finally lost its grip. I sat in my office that evening, watching the sun set over the city. The same city where I'd been erased in public, the same city where I'd rebuilt something better. I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who trusted explanations over instincts. The one who stayed quiet to keep peace. The one who believed love meant enduring confusion. Then I thought about the woman I'd become. A woman who understood that love didn't require erasure. That respect wasn't something you negotiated for. That dignity, once taken, didn't need to be reclaimed from the person who stole it. It only needed to be reclaimed within yourself. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been erased by someone who claimed to love you? Have you ever stood in a room full of people and realized you were the only one who didn't know the truth? Have you ever had to decide whether to disappear quietly or to become someone who couldn't be ignored? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't showing up to be chosen. It's walking away once you realize you never should have had to compete for your place. I didn't win because I became powerful. I won because I stopped disappearing. And that is a victory no one can ever take from me. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone who should have seen you, please share it with someone who needs to hear this. Check out the video in the description. I think you'll love it. And remember, you are worthy of being seen. Goodbye for now.